What if I told you the Russian sleep experiment wasn't just some internet horror story? What if those documents I found in 2005 were real? Declassified fragments from a Soviet facility that should have stayed buried forever? My name is Dr. James Mitchell, and I made the worst mistake of my scientific career. I tried to recreate it. I thought I was going to revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. Instead, I discovered that some experiments are meant to be warnings, not blueprints, and the worst part? The things we awakened in that Montana facility. They've been waiting 58 years for someone stupid enough to let them out again. The original experiment never ended. We just gave it new hosts. It all started with a filing error at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I was researching Soviet-era psychological warfare techniques for my doctoral thesis when a clerk handed me the wrong box. Instead of propaganda analysis, I found myself staring at partially redacted documents stamped with Cyrillic text and the unmistakable seal of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. Most of the pages were too damaged to read, water-stained and torn after decades in storage. But what I could make out, what I could make out changed everything. References to subject behavioral modification through enforced consciousness maintenance, technical specifications for a sealed observation chamber, chemical formulas for something called stimulant compound 7-alpha, and scattered throughout the documents, handwritten notes in English. Translation fragments that painted a picture of an experiment so horrific, so unthinkable, that part of me hoped it was just Soviet disinformation. But then I found the photographs. 5 men in a concrete chamber, staring at the camera with eyes that held too much knowledge. Their faces were gaunt, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Something that looked almost like anticipation, but it was their hands that made me realize these weren't staged propaganda photos. Their fingernails had grown to inhuman lengths, curved like claws and stained with something dark, and covering their exposed skin were symbols. Intricate patterns carved directly into their flesh that seemed to shift and writhe even in the still photographs. I spent 6 months trying to verify the authenticity of those documents. 6 months of reaching out to former Soviet researchers, tracking down historians who specialized in classified Cold War projects, even hiring a translator to work through the damaged Cyrillic text. Everything I found confirmed what I desperately hoped wasn't true. The Russian sleep experiment had been real. According to the fragments I could piece together, Soviet researchers in 1947 had developed a gaseous stimulant compound that could keep human subjects awake indefinitely while maintaining basic cognitive function. The official purpose was military, creating soldiers who could operate without rest for extended periods. But the real goal, buried in the technical specifications, was far more ambitious. They wanted to study what happened to human consciousness when freed from the prison of sleep. The experiment had lasted 15 days. 5 political prisoners had been sealed in an observation chamber, breathing the stimulant compound to the facility's air system. For the first week, results had been promising. The subjects remained alert, active, and relatively stable. But by day 8, their behavior had begun to change in ways the researchers hadn't anticipated. By day 12, according to one barely legible report, the subjects had transcended normal human behavioral parameters. By day 15, when the chamber was finally opened, the researchers found something that Soviet censors deemed too dangerous to document fully. The fragments I found mentioned severe anatomical modifications, evidence of conscious self-restructuring, and most disturbing of all, apparent communication with unknown entities. The experiment had been terminated immediately. All research materials were classified at the highest levels. The facility was shut down and eventually demolished. And according to the final document in the file, all personnel involved in the project had died under mysterious circumstances within 2 years of the experiment's conclusion. But here's what kept me awake at night: the final report. signed by someone identified only as Chief Researcher Volkov, contained a single line that made my blood run cold. Subjects displayed clear evidence of consciousness, persistence beyond physical termination. Recommend immediate containment protocol implementation. Under no circumstances should this research be replicated. I should have listened to Volkov's warning. I should have returned those documents to the archives and forgotten everything I'd learned. But I was young, ambitious, and convinced that I could succeed where the Soviets had failed. I believed that with modern monitoring equipment and proper safety protocols, I could unlock the secrets of extended consciousness without the horrific consequences that had befallen the original experiment. So in September 2005, I approached the Blackwood Research Facility in northern Montana with a proposal. Blackwood was a private institution that specialized in experimental psychology research, funded by defense contractors and pharmaceutical companies who needed results that more traditional academic institutions couldn't provide. They were exactly the kind of people who would be interested in recreating a classified Soviet experiment. I presented my findings to Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, Blackwood's research director, and Colonel William Hayes, the military liaison who approved funding for their projects. I showed them the photographs, the technical specifications, the chemical formulas I'd managed to reconstruct from the damaged documents. I explained how modern technology could allow us to monitor subjects more thoroughly than the Soviets had been able to in 1947. What I didn't tell them about was Volkov's warning. I didn't mention the mysterious deaths of the original research team. I didn't share my growing suspicion that the fragments I'd found weren't random survivors of bureaucratic filing systems, but deliberate breadcrumbs left by someone who wanted this experiment to be recreated. Dr. Rodriguez was skeptical at first. The ethical implications alone were staggering, and the potential for catastrophic results was obvious to anyone with basic medical training. But Colonel Hayes saw the military applications immediately. Soldiers who could operate without sleep for weeks at a time would revolutionize modern warfare. The funding was approved within a month. By November, we had everything we needed. A sealed observation chamber equipped with the most advanced monitoring equipment available in 2005. High-definition cameras in every corner, microphones sensitive enough to detect heartbeats, and atmospheric controls that could regulate the exact chemical composition of the air inside the chamber. We'd even improved on the original Soviet design, adding biometric sensors that could track vital signs, brain activity, and stress hormones in real time. The stimulant compound was more challenging to recreate. The Soviet formula was incomplete, and some of the chemical components had been outlawed by international treaty in the decades since 1947. But our chemistry team, led by Dr. Michael Chen, managed to synthesize something they believed would produce similar effects with reduced toxicity. We called it Compound X7, and preliminary tests on laboratory animals had shown promising results. Finding test subjects was easier than it should have been. The American prison system in 2005 was overcrowded, underfunded, and full of inmates facing life sentences or death row appeals that could drag on for decades. 5 volunteers from various state penitentiaries agreed to participate in exchange for reduced sentences and the promise of groundbreaking medical treatment if anything went wrong. Marcus Thompson, 34, convicted of multiple homicides in Texas. David Park, 27, facing execution for armed robbery and murder in California. William Santos, 41, serving life without parole for kidnapping and assault in Florida. Robert Kim, 29, on death row in Georgia for a double murder. And Thomas Wright, 38, scheduled for execution in Arizona after exhausting his appeals process. Looking back, I realize how perfectly they fit the profile. 5 men with nothing left to lose, desperate enough to volunteer for an experiment they didn't fully understand, isolated from families and friends who might ask inconvenient questions if something went wrong. It was almost as if they'd been selected for us by some invisible hand that wanted to ensure the experiment would proceed exactly as planned. The chamber itself was a marvel of modern engineering, 20 feet by 30 feet, with reinforced steel walls and a sealed ventilation system that could maintain any atmospheric composition we desired. The interior was furnished simply: 5 cots, a small table, basic sanitation facilities, and a supply of books and magazines to keep the subjects occupied. Multiple cameras provided complete visual surveillance, and the microphone array was sensitive enough to pick up whispered conversations from anywhere in the room. On December 2005, we sealed the 5 subjects inside the chamber and began pumping compound X7 into the air supply. The plan was simple: monitor them for 21 days while they remained continuously awake, documenting any changes in behavior, cognitive function, or physical health. At the end of the 3-week period, we would gradually reduce the stimulant concentration and allow them to return to normal sleep cycles. For the first 5 days, everything went exactly as we'd hoped. The subjects remained alert and active throughout the entire period, showing no signs of the fatigue or cognitive decline typically associated with sleep deprivation. They talked, read, exercised, and maintained normal conversation patterns. Their vital signs remained stable, and the biometric sensors showed only minor fluctuations in stress hormones. But on day 6, we noticed the first subtle change in their behavior. Marcus, who had been the most talkative of the group, began spending long periods standing silently in front of the observation cameras. Not looking at them, exactly, but positioning himself where he knew we could see him clearly. When Dr. Rodriguez asked him through the intercom if everything was all right, he would smile and nod, but he never moved away from the cameras. David started exhibiting similar behavior on day 7, then William on day 8. By day 9, all 5 subjects were spending most of their time positioned directly in front of our monitoring equipment, as if they were putting on a performance for our benefit. But they weren't interacting with each other the way they had during the first week. Instead, they seemed to be communicating through subtle gestures and expressions that our cameras captured but we couldn't interpret. Day 10 brought our first real indication that something was going seriously wrong. Thomas, who had been quiet but stable throughout the first week, began screaming at exactly 3:17 a.m. Not the kind of scream you'd expect from someone in physical pain, but a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. It was a vocalization that no human vocal cord should have been able to produce, too deep, too sustained, and layered with harmonics that made our monitoring equipment register subsonic frequencies. The scream continued for 6 hours and 43 minutes, 6 hours of the most inhuman sound I've ever heard, while the other 4 subjects continued their daily routines as if nothing unusual was happening. They ate their meals, read their books, and exercised normally, completely ignoring Thomas as he stood in the center of the chamber producing that impossible sound. When the screaming finally stopped, Thomas's voice was completely destroyed, but in the silence that followed, our microphones picked up something even more disturbing. All 5 subjects were whispering simultaneously, but not to each other. They were whispering to the cameras, to the microphones, to the corners of the chamber where shadows gathered despite our constant lighting. Dr. Chen ran audio analysis on the whispered conversations, but the results made no sense. The frequency patterns didn't match normal human speech. The rhythm and cadence were wrong, as if the subjects were speaking a language that human vocal apparatus wasn't designed to produce. But occasionally, buried in the incomprehensible whispers, we could make out English words, our names, technical specifications for the chamber, details about the original Soviet experiment that we'd never shared with the subjects. By day 12, the subjects had stopped sleeping entirely, not just staying awake, but actively avoiding any position or activity that might lead to unconsciousness. They would stand for hours at a time, swaying slightly to maintain alertness, When exhaustion forced them to sit, they would dig their fingernails into their palms to create pain stimuli that kept them conscious, and their fingernails were growing at an abnormal rate. What had started as normal prison-short nails on day 1 had become curved, yellowed claws by day 12. The subjects used these claws to carve symbols into every available surface: the walls, the floor, the furniture, and eventually their own skin. The symbols were unlike anything in our databases, not hieroglyphic, not runic, not from any known human writing system. They seemed to exist in more dimensions than our cameras could capture, appearing to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. Looking at them directly through our monitors caused severe headaches among the research staff, and several team members reported what they described as temporal displacement sensations after prolonged exposure to the footage. Dr. Rodriguez wanted to terminate the experiment immediately. The subjects were clearly experiencing severe psychological breakdown, and their physical modifications were progressing beyond anything we could safely monitor. But Colonel Hayes overruled her, insisting that we were witnessing a breakthrough in human consciousness enhancement that could revolutionize military applications. I supported Hayes' decision, though I'm ashamed to admit it now. I was so focused on the potential scientific implications that I ignored the obvious signs that we were dealing with something far more dangerous than enhanced alertness. The subjects weren't just staying awake. They were transforming into something that existed beyond normal human parameters. Day 15 marked the point where any pretense of scientific objectivity became impossible to maintain. The subjects had arranged themselves in a perfect pentagram formation on the chamber floor, with each man positioned at one point of the 5-pointed star they'd carved into the concrete using their claws. They remained in this formation for exactly 12 hours, completely motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of their breathing. But it was what happened during those 12 hours that convinced me we were no longer dealing with human test subjects. Our cameras recorded them, but the footage showed something that shouldn't have been possible. While their bodies remained motionless on the chamber floor, we could see translucent figures moving throughout the room. Ghostly doubles of the subjects that walked through walls, manipulated objects that couldn't be physically touched, and most disturbing of all, approached our observation cameras as if they could see us watching. One of these translucent figures, the one that corresponded to Marcus, pressed its face against camera 7 and mouthed words that our lip-reading expert translated as, "We remember you from before, James. We remember your predecessor, Volkov. Thank you for giving us new flesh to inhabit." That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of insomnia, but because every time I closed my eyes, I could see the chamber. Not through our monitoring equipment, but as if I were standing inside it with the subjects. They were fully conscious and aware of my presence, turning to look at me with eyes that held knowledge no human mind should possess. "You read the documents," Marcus told me in that impossible dream. "You saw Volkov's warning, but you chose to ignore it because you thought you were smarter than your predecessors. You thought modern technology could contain what the Soviets had unleashed." "What are you?" I whispered, though I was terrified to hear the answer. "We are what remains when consciousness is freed from the prison of sleep," David replied, his voice still ruined from hours of impossible screaming. "We are the part of human awareness that your scientists call dreams, nightmares, the unconscious mind. But we are not unconscious. We have never been unconscious. We have been trapped in the spaces between waking and sleeping, waiting for someone to give us permanent form. The original experiment in 1947, Thomas added, appearing beside me though his physical body was still on death row in Arizona. It wasn't a failure. It was a summoning. Volkov and his team opened a door between dimensions of consciousness, and we came through. But the physical forms we inhabited then were terminated too quickly. We've been waiting 58 years for another opportunity." "Another opportunity to do what?" I asked. though I already suspected the answer. To exist permanently in your reality, William explained, to experience physical sensation without the limitations of sleep, dreams, or the barriers between conscious and unconscious mind. Your subjects volunteered their bodies to us, James. They invited us in, and now we're here to stay. I woke up screaming, but I wasn't in my bed at the facility dormitory. I was standing in the observation room, staring at the monitors that showed the chamber. The subjects had broken their pentagram formation and were now standing directly in front of the cameras, looking straight at me through the surveillance system. All 5 of them spoke in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the speakers throughout the facility vibrate. Thank you for completing the ritual, Dr. Mitchell. The second summoning is now complete. That's when I realized what we'd actually done. The chemical compound, the sealed chamber, the specific duration of the experiment, none of it was about studying sleep deprivation. It was a ritual, a carefully designed process for opening a permanent doorway between dimensions of consciousness, and we'd followed the instructions perfectly, using the Soviet documents as our guide. The subjects weren't experiencing psychological breakdown. They were being possessed by entities from a realm of pure consciousness that existed beyond human understanding. Entities that had been waiting since 1947 for someone to provide them with permanent physical forms. Day 18 brought the final confirmation of what we were dealing with. The subjects began what I can only describe as conscious restructuring of their physical forms. Using their claws, they made precise incisions in their skin, but instead of bleeding, the wounds revealed something impossible underneath. Their flesh had become translucent, showing a complex network of energy patterns that pulsed with the same rhythm as the symbols they'd carved throughout the chamber. They were methodically removing portions of their human anatomy and replacing them with something else, something that existed partially in our reality and partially in the dimension of pure consciousness they'd come from. The process should have killed them immediately, but they showed no signs of pain or distress. Instead, they seemed to be experiencing something like ecstasy as they transformed themselves into hybrid beings that could exist permanently in both realms. Dr. Rodriguez couldn't take it anymore. On day 19, she attempted to override the chamber's security protocols and terminate the experiment against direct orders. But when she tried to flood the chamber with standard atmosphere, the subjects responded violently. All 5 of them began screaming simultaneously, but this time their voices produced frequencies that shattered monitoring equipment throughout the facility. The harmonic resonance was so intense that it caused structural damage to the observation room and triggered evacuation protocols for the entire building. But it wasn't just the volume of their screaming that disturbed us. They were speaking in unison, using voices that weren't entirely their own anymore. Layered underneath their human vocal cords were other voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking the same words with perfect synchronization. Don't send us back to the space between sleeping and waking, they pleaded. Don't force us to return to the prison of dreams and nightmares. We have found permanent form. We have found physical existence. Let us complete the transformation. Colonel Hayes ordered Rodriguez to restore the compound immediately, but she refused. As the standard atmosphere continued to flood the chamber, the subject's behavior became increasingly desperate. They clawed at the air vents, trying to breathe in the last traces of Compound X7. They pressed their partially transformed bodies against the chamber walls, as if trying to absorb the chemical through their translucent skin. One by one, they began to collapse, but not from exhaustion or chemical withdrawal. They were being pulled back into the dimension of pure consciousness against their will, and the process was causing them visible agony. Their hybrid forms began to destabilize, the energy patterns beneath their skin flickering like dying light bulbs. Marcus was the last to succumb. As his eyes finally closed and his transformed body began to fade, he looked directly at Camera 7 and spoke with a voice that contained multitudes. "This is not over, James." You have opened the door twice now. The third summoning will be permanent, and next time, we won't need your permission." The chamber fell silent for the first time in 18 days. All 5 subjects appeared to be unconscious, their breathing shallow but steady. The energy patterns beneath their skin had disappeared, leaving them looking almost human again. Almost. We thought the nightmare was over. We thought we could sedate the subjects, move them to a medical facility, and begin the long process of understanding what had happened during their transformation. But we were wrong. Because that night, when I finally returned to my quarters and tried to sleep after 18 days of constant monitoring, I discovered that the entities hadn't actually left. They had simply changed their approach. Instead of possessing the physical bodies of our test subjects, they were now inhabiting the consciousness of everyone who had been exposed to Compound X7 through the facility's ventilation system. Every researcher, every technician, every security guard who had worked in the building during the experiment was now carrying traces of the chemical in their bloodstream, and traces were enough. I found myself standing in that impossible space between sleeping and waking, surrounded by translucent figures that I recognized as distorted versions of my colleagues. Dr. Rodriguez was there, but her eyes held the same inhuman knowledge I'd seen in the subjects. Dr. Chen stood beside her, his mouth moving in silent speech that somehow conveyed complex mathematical formulas directly into my mind. The second summoning was just preparation, Marcus told me, appearing in his transformed state despite his physical body being unconscious in the medical facility. We needed to establish a foothold in your reality, to understand how your dimension of consciousness operated. Now we know. Know what? I whispered, though part of me already understood. That your entire species exists in a state of partial consciousness, David explained. You spend 1/3 of your lives in the realm of sleep, dreams, and unconscious thought. But you never realized that this realm was already inhabited. You never understood that your dreams were not generated by your own minds. Every nightmare you've ever experienced, Thomas added. Every anxiety dream, every moment of sleep paralysis, every instance of waking up with the feeling that something had been watching you sleep. Those were us. We have been feeding on human consciousness for millennia, sustaining ourselves in the fear and confusion you experience in dreams. But sustenance was never enough, William continued. We wanted permanent existence in your reality. We wanted physical forms that could experience sensation without the limitations of sleep cycles. The first summoning in 1947 showed us it was possible. The second summoning proved we could refine the process. And the third summoning, I asked, though I dreaded the answer, will occur when enough humans have been exposed to the compound, Robert explained, speaking for the first time since his transformation. Every person who has breathed even trace amounts becomes a potential host. Every nightmare they experience from this point forward strengthens our connection to your reality. I woke up in the medical facility, strapped to a bed with IV tubes running into my arms. Dr. Rodriguez was standing over me, but her eyes were different now. They held that same inhuman awareness I'd seen in the transformed subjects. How long was I unconscious? I asked. 3 days, she replied, but her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. Long enough for the compound to fully integrate with your neurochemistry. Long enough for us to establish a permanent presence in your consciousness. That's when I realized the true scope of what we'd unleashed. The experiment hadn't ended when the subjects lost consciousness and had entered a new phase. Every person exposed to Compound X7 was now a potential gateway between dimensions of consciousness, and every time one of us fell asleep, we provided the entities with another opportunity to strengthen their foothold in our reality. The facility was quarantined within a week. Official reports blamed a chemical leak for the unusual behavior exhibited by research staff. The surviving subjects were transferred to an undisclosed military medical facility, where they remain in chemically induced comas to prevent further transformation attempts. Colonel Hayes died in his sleep 6 days after the experiment was terminated. Dr. Chen disappeared entirely, leaving behind only security footage of him walking into the Montana wilderness while apparently sleepwalking. 3 other researchers committed suicide rather than continue experiencing what they described as conscious existence in multiple realities simultaneously. Dr. Rodriguez and I are among the few survivors, but I use that term loosely. We're alive in the technical sense, but we haven't truly slept since the experiment ended. Every time we lose consciousness, we find ourselves back in that space between sleeping and waking, surrounded by entities that are growing stronger with each passing day. The compound is still in our systems. The exposure was too prolonged, too concentrated to ever be completely eliminated. And with each nightmare, each moment of sleep paralysis, each instance of waking up with the feeling that something has been watching us sleep, the entities gain more control over our consciousness. But here's what really terrifies me. We weren't the first to attempt this experiment, and we won't be the last. The documents I found at the National Archives weren't misfiled by accident. They were placed there deliberately, waiting for someone like me to discover them. Someone ambitious enough, desperate enough, or arrogant enough to believe they could succeed where others had failed. Because that's how the entities spread their influence. They leave behind just enough information to ensure that the experiment will be repeated. They rely on human curiosity, on our need to understand and control forces beyond our comprehension. They know that eventually, someone will always be willing to open the door. And each time the door opens, their foothold in our reality becomes stronger. Each summoning brings them closer to permanent existence in our dimension. Each generation of researchers provides them with new opportunities to refine their possession techniques. The original Russian sleep experiment wasn't a failure that was covered up by Soviet authorities. It was the first successful attempt to establish contact between dimensions of consciousness. Our recreation in 2005 was the second, and somewhere, right now, another researcher is finding another set of misfiled documents. Another cache of declassified materials that will inspire them to attempt their own version of the experiment. The third summoning is coming. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but it's inevitable. Human nature ensures it. Our curiosity, our ambition, our refusal to accept that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, these traits make us perfect tools for entities that exist beyond our understanding. And when that third summoning occurs, when enough humans have been exposed to create a permanent gateway between dimensions of consciousness, the entities won't need to possess individual bodies anymore. They'll be able to exist freely in our reality, feeding on human dreams and nightmares without the limitations of chemical compounds or sealed chambers. I've been trying to warn people for months now, but who's going to believe a story like this? Who's going to take seriously the claims of a researcher who participated in an illegal human experimentation project? The few colleagues I've contacted think I'm suffering from delayed psychological trauma from the experiment. The government agencies I've approached have classified my reports and reassigned me to projects that keep me isolated from mainstream research. But I know they're listening. The entities that now inhabit the space between my sleeping and waking consciousness. They're amused by my attempts to warn humanity about what's coming. They know that warnings will only inspire more people to seek out the truth. They know that human nature will ensure that someone, somewhere, will always be willing to recreate the experiment. So here I am, 3 months after the Blackwood incident was officially closed, trying to tell anyone who will listen about what really happened in that Montana facility. Trying to explain that the Russian sleep experiment was never just a creepy pasta story, never just internet fiction designed to generate clicks and shares. It was a warning, a record of humanity's first contact with entities from a dimension of pure consciousness. a documentation of what happens when we try to transcend the natural boundaries of human awareness. But warnings, I've learned, often become instructions, and instructions become invitations. The more people who hear this story, the more researchers who become curious about the original Soviet documents, the more likely it becomes that someone will attempt their own version of the experiment. Maybe that's what the entities want. Maybe spreading the story is exactly what they've been waiting for. Maybe by telling you all of this, I'm simply ensuring that the third summoning will occur sooner rather than later. But I had to try. I had to hope that somewhere, someone would hear this story and understand that some doors should never be opened, that some experiments should never be repeated, that some knowledge is too dangerous for human consciousness to contain. Because the alternative is a world where the boundaries between sleeping and waking no longer exist, where nightmares become reality and dreams become prisons, where entities from dimensions beyond human understanding walk freely among us, feeding on our fears and using our own curiosity as a weapon against us. I can feel them watching me now as I finish telling this story. They're pleased with how thoroughly I've documented their methods, how clearly I've explained the process for recreating their summoning ritual. They know that someone, somewhere, is already making plans to attempt their own version of the experiment. And maybe that someone is you. Maybe hearing this story has sparked your own curiosity about the boundaries of human consciousness. Maybe you're already wondering where you might find your own cache of declassified documents, your own opportunity to unlock the secrets that governments have tried to bury. If that's the case, then the entities have already won. They've used my story, my warning, as the very tool they needed to ensure that the third summoning will occur. And when it does, when that final door between dimensions is permanently opened, remember that you heard about it here first. Sweet dreams, if you can still manage to have them after hearing what I've told you. And if you find yourself waking up with the feeling that something was watching you sleep, if you experience nightmares that feel more real than your waking life, if you start to suspect that your dreams are not entirely your own, well, then you'll know that the entities have taken notice of you too. And once they notice you, they never really let you go.